Hello, Matt.
Hey Graham, good to see you.
Good to see you. Welcome, everyone, to Crazy in Love, the podcast where two therapists talk about all things to do with relationships. Today, Matt, we're going to talk about great expectations, aren't we? We're going to talk about some of the historical changes in how people view relationships, what they want to get out of relationships. And just to set the scene, I think we're talking about how relationships have gone from, and particularly kind of romantic relationships, have gone from a place of maybe more transactional, maybe more practical, focused on family, focused on economics, to a place maybe from the Victorian times onwards where romantic relationships became more about love and security. And then maybe a third phase that someone like Eli Finkel might call the kind of third phase of romantic relationships, where they became more about the self, more about seeing your partner as someone who, yes, you love and care about, but also someone who's going to help you grow as an individual, someone who's going to help you meet your needs of self-actualization. And we can maybe dissect that in a bit more detail as we go. I think it's also fair to say that we're quite skeptical in the modern world of those more transactional type relationships, aren't we? When we see someone like Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton, we kind of look at their relationship and sneer a little bit and say, well, they're only in it for the power benefits. They're only in it for the benefits for them on an individual level. And we're a bit skeptical where we don't see a lot of love and don't see a lot of romance. So how are you coming to this conversation? How do you kind of perceive that shift in expectations over the years? Is it a healthy thing for us to expect so much more from our partners, or does it come with some problems?
Yeah, I think it does come with some problems, doesn't it? I think you and I probably agree that expectations have got a little out of kilter with the reality of what long-term relationships can deliver you. So, I mean, I guess I find myself in two minds really. One is that I think we have loaded up expectations on relationships, and we're asking for them to do so much, for our partner to be our friend and maybe our therapist, our cheerleader, our confidant, like someone that we go to, turn to in almost any and every circumstance. And that sort of shift through to self-actualizing, that feels like a lot to load onto a relationship. And I think we probably think that sometimes when we meet couples, those very high expectations are in themselves a recipe for disaster. I think the other side of that, the other side of the coin, is that of course we all want to be seen and validated, right, in some way, shape, or form. We want to be acknowledged. We want to be appreciated, heard, understood. All of those sorts of things. And I don't think there's anything pathological or weird or overly needy about that. So I suppose where we end up is somewhere like there's a sweet spot between those two extremes.
Let's step back a little bit and piece it together piece by piece. So someone like Eli Finkel, he's for those who are listening that don't know who he is, he's in effect a kind of couples researcher, isn't he? He's an academic
Yeah.
who does a lot of work around what modern relationships look like, but also the evolution of relationships over time. And he has published a book called The All or Nothing Marriage, and that device, that idea of the all or nothing relationship, lays out this idea of we should either go down the route of investing a huge amount into our relationships, like we were talking about, in terms of not just a romantic partner who we love, but someone who's going to make us realize all our dreams and goals for our own lives, or this idea of managing our expectations, lowering our expectations, trying to, in effect, just have the kind of marriage where you might share a house and raise children and get the daily tasks done, and that as long as you're not arguing constantly, as long as you're relatively compatible as human beings and having the occasional sex, that can be enough for a
Yeah.
lot of people. Whereas the modern world, and certainly in pop culture, we get fed this idea consistently that relationships should be much, much more than that, and
Yeah.
potentially too much, in the sense of you're expecting your partner to be both the solid, stable, secure person who you rely on for warmth and compassion and generosity, but you're also, on the other hand, expecting them to be this incredibly exciting,
Mhm.
diverse, sexually attractive, mysterious person who holds your attention in that way as well. And I think what we're suggesting in response to that is that that is probably too much, that those extremes are too much to expect in
Yeah.
one person, and that those tensions between, for example, independence and codependence, between freedom and responsibility, have to get resolved in some ways within an individual, but expecting them to be resolved in one relationship is probably a bit too much.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a nice summary. That's about right. I mean, what I don't particularly like about the way he divides that up, I mean, maybe we're being a bit I was going to say it's a bit crude. Maybe we're being a bit crude about in terms of our analysis of that book and that work. But it felt like too much. It felt like there are degrees of marriage and there are different ways of being together that suit different people. So yeah, I see a lot of couples who are mean to one another and withholding.
Mm,
They argue a lot. They're critical of one another. They're not generous with their compliments or their appreciation for one another. And sometimes what I'm doing, I think, is just trying to shift that a bit, trying to move that on so that we do end up somewhere in the middle of people who can stand on their own 2 feet and form a cohesive economic unit and be coherent, kind of holding presence for the kids, love them, get them to bed on time, feed them decent food, care about their schooling and their friendships and all of that, and have a bit of time for one another as well. And I suppose for me, the whole thing feels sort of compromised. It feels like trade-off. So any sort of notion of all or nothing or one thing or the other, I think I'm instinctively not drawn to. It's a bit like, I like the example of the Clintons' marriage. I mean, who knows what the truth of that marriage
exactly.
is really? I wouldn't speculate, but in sort of popular discourse, that it is transactional, that they've used one another, that they function as a sort of business partner, rather than there being being a kind of wild love affair.
Yeah, and from the outside looking in, you have to side with one or the other. So a lot of the sympathy often goes to Hillary, doesn't it? That she has been used and abused within that relationship, and it's now her turn almost to step out of his shadow and take the reins. And I imagine the reality of their relationship is a lot more complex in every sense than that.
Yeah. I think it also works the other way, though. I mean, I think she's a figure who doesn't draw much sympathy because she stuck around because she wanted
Mm,
something from it. So rather than act with dignity or integrity, particularly around that, particular incident with Monica Lewinsky, she stayed because it was convenient to her. Her life would have been less good, and her, subsequent presidential run would have been, ruled out maybe in those circumstances. It feels like the analysis is she thought her best bet was to stick. I'm not sure I buy all of that, but I think
mm.
that's the other way it plays out.
No, interesting. You often talk about, I think, is it Esther Perel that talks about kind of the new shame, modern shame is staying
Yeah,
around
yeah,
when a partner cheats, and that
yeah, yeah,
that she might have been the victim of that shift in mentality
yeah,
towards the idea of the woman. She quite literally used the phrase "stand by her man," didn't she? The old Tammy Wynette phrase at the time,
yeah,
"I'm going to stand by my man."
yeah, yeah.
Maybe if she was in the 1950s, that might have been a different response to when it was in what the kind of late 1990s, early 2000s.
There's a bit about integrity there, isn't it? We might be off topic, but you don't really believe that Hillary, the character that we know, is really a stand by your man kind of person. We don't really believe she likes that music or knows it or that that's in her blood. So I think if she'd taken a more radical feminist stance and said, I'm, financially equipped to leave him and I'm leaving, I think we would have bought it. It didn't quite line up maybe.
Yeah, interesting. Well, one of the maybe kind of cultural threads we can have a pull on is in the all or nothing dichotomy that someone like Eli Finkel presents is some of what I see in the modern discourse, less in the therapy room and more in kind of popular culture of encouragement for people to break up for relatively small
Yeah.
things. This
Yeah.
idea that the relationship should be everything or it should be nothing. So someone has to meet all of your emotional needs. And if there's something that doesn't quite fit, that not only should you break up with someone, but you should almost label them as having some sort of insecure attachment style, for example, label them as overly avoidant, or label them as narcissistic, or label them as emotionally immature, whatever it might be, rather than this is just someone who's a bit different to me and I struggle to live with the trade-offs involved in two different people trying to share a house together.
Yeah, it's a big part of the answer, isn't it? I was just going to bring us back to the idea of the sort of boring but happy marriage that I think you were describing, that things can be a bit mundane, it can be practical, or it can be a phase of married life. I think that can potentially work. But there's a I think the problem with boring but happy is it's often not happy for people where
Yep.
they're not being met, understood, appreciated, validated. I think that bit is that bit's a bit too much for people to bear. So the sort of notion of a boring but happy marriage for me is I don't think it's happy. Like when I see people, it doesn't seem happy. There's very few people who can set that that sort of human need for validation aside.
Let's stay with that idea of boring but happy for a while, though, because I think that is what a lot of people are aiming for, isn't it? Kind of not necessarily boring, but most people are aiming for a life where they go to work, they return home to a partner who they care about, and they choose to raise kids, or they don't choose to raise kids, whatever it might look like. They're not generally telling a story of like they want a life partner to go partying with most.
No, I think they're looking for something in the evening, though. There's quite a lot, isn't there? I don't think we've spoken about this on the pod before, but we're talking about that idea of how you use your hours in the evening. I'm not sure what that idea has even got a name.
The 3 hour evening almost.
The
Yeah.
3 hour evening, yeah, brilliant. How did they think of that? The 3 hour evening when you sort of do your
That sounds
chores for the
optimistic to me, I've got to be honest.
yeah, you do your chores for the first hour. This is the idea. You do your chores for the first hour. You then spend a kind of an hour together, which is unbroken concentration on one another. So you wouldn't really be watching a show together. You definitely wouldn't be on your phones. You would be talking to one another, making yourself available to the other person, listening, tuning in, sharing some of your day, and then the last hour is up to you to do what you want, and then you can scroll. You could choose to watch something together, you could go to separate rooms, whatever else it might be. So I think that sort of bit in the middle, the hour in the middle where you're there for one another, I hear people wanting that a lot. They do want to come home and connect, be heard, understood, have their day mean something to somebody else. So not kind of exciting, not partying, but that's human, that need. Whether or not you'd have it for as long as an hour, whether you need that every evening, we could talk about that. But in some regular, reasonably predictable, recurring way, that does seem to be quite a strong need that I hear when I'm talking to couples.
Yes, I agree with that. I'd push back in a similar way to what you just suggested we might open the door to, which is about whether it needs to happen every day, whether it needs to happen every evening, and
Yeah.
what happens to those feelings if you don't get met where you are when you return home. That I think what we see is quite a lot of resentment and kind of retreat into silence rather than, okay, if they're not able to do that for me right now, I'll have another go again tomorrow.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
a lot of broad conclusions about I'm in a relationship where this can't happen, rather than right here, right now, we're in different places. Let's go again tomorrow.
That would be the point about expectations, right? To come back to where we started off, that our great expectations are that each evening we'll be able to do this, and the other person will be immediately able to lock in, tune in, find the right questions, not disappoint us in any way, not start to problem solve when we just wanted to be listened to, not just keep listening when actually we'd quite like them to join in and think practically about how we resolve an issue. That
Yeah, I'd broaden it out. Maybe bring us back to that 3 hour evening if you think it's relevant. But I'd broaden out our conversation to talk about the irreconcilable tensions in life more generally. I don't think I've talked before on the pod about kind of my love for Bruce Springsteen. So indulge me for a second. That I'm a massive fan of Bruce, and how in his early life he was very much about the self, the independence, born to run, escape New Jersey, go to the promised land, etc., all about cars and hitting the road,
yeah.
which is great when you're 20. Then he evolved into something a bit more nuanced, right? In terms of family man, expectations around that. But I think what plays out in his life and his music is this irreconcilable tension between freedom and responsibility, between being on your own and enjoying and indulging that, but also the gift of responsibility and the gratitude for something bigger than himself. And but I think a thread running through his work is that can't be reconciled within one life or one relationship, that you're always going to have to be dealing with frustrations and tensions. There are ways that you can meet some of those needs. If you're someone that needs something that the relationship can't give you, you might look elsewhere through other people, through other things that you do with your time. But fundamentally, you're going to have to live with some of those irreconcilable tensions. And I think the modern world and modern culture tells you you can have it all,
Yeah.
and you can have it all with one person, which I think creates a huge amount of not only tension within the relationship, but bad decisions, particularly in midlife, bad decisions to break up and leave, expecting that this
Yeah.
life elsewhere is going to give you the freedom and the sense of calm that comes with resolving some of those tensions that can't ultimately be resolved.
Yeah, yeah, it's a nice example, and I mean, you know a great deal more about him and his life and music than I do, but I think he lives about 5 minutes down the road from where he grew up on
Yep.
a farm that he's lived on for decades now. Although he had been married before, he's now been living with that person for multiple decades as well. Actually, on the face of it, it's a very steady life. He's found a sort of outlet for the tension, and he talks about it. It's like it's a part of him. If you hear him, you sent me a lovely podcast with him recently where he talks about that sort of journey into family life. But it's there as a I don't know, as a battle or as a challenge to be involved in family life, to get up at 6:30 and make the pancakes. I think is the example that he gives,
Yes, and I don't imagine even he,
rather than be the rock and roll god, right? Who's
rather than
in,
be the rock and roll god, but he then does go on tour, right? He then does go on tour. He works out a way of being able to have both of those things in his life. He's got that privilege to be able to do that. Most of us don't. Most of us can't divide our 12 months of the year into 6 months away from home with your mates, having the good old time, and then the 6 months at home with the kids, having that connection. Most of us have to do that each day or each week rather than divide our lives in quite that way. But even he would say that he doesn't, he's got those tensions within himself. And I think they've probably played out in his marriage in ways that in reality are probably more complicated than the story they portray.
yeah, yeah, sure. It made me think of how lots of couples experienced lockdown during those COVID times, and that it was too much for most couples in the main. So the people with nice family homes and gardens and adult children actually, still very broad analysis, but quite enjoyed COVID because the kids were home more. There was more activity to do with them. They're not such a drain on your time. They don't need looking after in that way, but their company is useful, and family life felt a bit richer. And the couples who were on their own, maybe in a flat that wasn't quite big enough, that sort of setup, found it claustrophobic, like didn't enjoy that period of time, like too much, too intense.
Mm,
Just
mm.
that idea, I suppose, of the sort of the Esther Perel idea, isn't it? And the guy you've been talking about as well, that there's a requirement for space in the relationship. And the example with with Bruce struck me as interesting, because you're absolutely right. He's not just going into the studio and composing or creating music. He is also literally on the road,
Yes.
for huge swathes of
Yeah. So
time.
he's able to manage those tensions in a way I think most people can't.
Yeah.
Bring us back to validation, Matt, because you often in
He's
our,
around other guys as well, isn't he? Sorry to just jump
yeah,
in. Let's
yeah,
do exactly as you suggest in a second, but like 10 seconds more. He
sure.
is around other guys. I think they're almost all guys in that band, and they seem like very. I was just watching something the other evening, like a documentary or something, trailer for it, so I don't see it in any detail. But there he was with the guys, and it felt a bit like a sports team to me. It felt a
Yeah.
bit like sort of guys in a bar, or guys in a pub, or five-a-side team sort of together. They've been together for ages. They know what they're doing, and it was guy time.
Yep, and they've grieved, lost bandmates as well together, so they go through it all together. They have a right old time. They have a great laugh together, but they've been through some stuff together as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting point.
And that would be the thing. 10 seconds more. That would be the thing about a lot of guys I see often don't have that.
Yes,
Not as a criticism of guys. I
definitely.
personally fairly fed up with the idea that sort of men are inferior women and have inferior relationships, but lots of guys just don't make time for that in a busy job, busy family life, kind of call on your time in terms of what your partner needs and what you want to give to them. Good guys who are trying hard will often, junk exercise or junk friendships, and probably they do it in the reverse order. They probably junk friendships and prioritize exercise, and that always feels like a sadness. It's been one of the most important things in my life to have a group of friends from roughly the age of about 11 years old, and to have stuck with them. It's been a really sustaining and important thing that I don't think I could have possibly gotten from any partner.
Yeah, lovely. Whereas I imagine a lot of the men that we're thinking of leave their relationships to try and find that with another woman, as opposed to
Yeah,
trying to
yeah.
find other ways to get that in it while staying in their relationship,
Yeah.
potentially.
You were going to take us somewhere else.
Well, it's going to take us back to validation, because often in these conversations, I think a lot of the time we're talking about managing expectations. We're talking about not seeking everything in a relationship, but it felt like you wanted to make a strong push in this conversation for having relatively high expectations for certain aspects of romantic relationships, that we shouldn't drop our expectations to have a certain amount of emotional resonance and emotional validation in the relationships we have. So just talk a bit, talk us.
Yeah. I think it felt a little bit like sort of a little bit like oxygen. I think was what I'd
Yeah.
noted down here for myself, that it's kind of essential but unnoticed, and until it's missing, you don't sort of realize quite how essential it is. It feels very important to be heard and understood. So that bit for me personally feels non-negotiable, but it does for most clients. I see very few who want to have a hands-off, flatmates, housemates, co-parents relationship alone. And I guess we see a skewed section of the population, don't we? The people who want help and who arguably need it. So maybe there's lots of people out there, living that life quite comfortably and don't seek any help with it. But I don't hear that request very often. The request is much more, we don't connect, we don't talk to one another, I don't feel appreciated, those sorts of things. And I guess the point I would make around that is, I don't think those conversations are necessarily all that easy to have. And I think the expectation is that we will immediately get what the other person says, will immediately feel understood, and it will be easy. And I don't think it is. So I think we should go after it personally, but I think we should also accept that it's really hard. I think of it almost as an elite skill. It's
Mm,
really a difficult thing to do. So the example I hear time and time again is something like, we never spend any time together anymore, which gets kind of met as a complaint, and the other person's response is something like, not this again,
mm,
well, sorry, I have to work, or perhaps if you got a job, and we've already gone into an argument. So rather than hearing that, as something like, I think you're saying, we don't spend as much time together as we used to, and you miss that. And I agree. And I miss it too. And I miss it in these ways, that we might connect. We might not have the solution, we might not suddenly have magicked up additional hours in an evening or across the week, but we have understood one another. And it might not sound like much, but I think that's where the magic is. And then we can get on to, okay, so what's the proposal? How do we work through this? What could we do differently? But that, for me, I would bracket off, the first bit. If you can't get that first bit right, that's where the problem comes. Not necessarily that you can fix something, not necessarily that it be quick and easy to do, but that I've said something to you and you've understood like the essence of what I've said, you've acknowledged that, and you've played it back to me in your in a way that makes sense to you, maybe even building on it or expanding it in some way.
mm.
That's often what I'm trying to do with people, and that I guess that would be some of the essence of what I'm trying to do, and it makes a bigger difference than you might suppose.
Mm. Yes, I agree strongly with that. Why do you think people struggle with that skill? You called it an elite skill. What's the difficulty of getting started with that?
Yeah, I mean, I wondered whether you thought it was an elite skill. I put it to somebody once as that this is an elite skill, and they wouldn't have it. They were like, it's not. It's really basic. And I was interested in what you think about that. Whether it does feel like a very,
I think it's quite an elite skill to be able to put aside your own ego in those moments, and your own move into defensiveness, and all the kind of ways that you can respond to that feeling of being criticized, and to step into a place of, well, it feels like I'm being criticized, but actually this, my partner's saying something important that I need to try and lock into and try and validate here before I respond from that ego place, which I think speaks to a broader point I wanted to bring in, though, around, I think in some ways, that all or nothing framework for a marriage or a relationship is way too focused on the self anyway, is way too focused on getting your own needs met, is
Sure.
way too focused on kind of defending yourself and building yourself, when I think many of the best things about being in a great relationship or raising kids together or building a life together in other ways is about the investment in something bigger than oneself.
Yeah.
Go wherever you want to with that. Like, if you want to bring us back to the kind of validation skill, or whether you want to pick up that broader point. But I
Yeah.
agree with the idea that it is an elite skill that requires a huge amount of practice as well. It's one of those classic things in therapy and couples work, which is easy to say,
Yeah.
very, very
What to do.
simple,
Yeah.
but hard to do. And I imagine you'd like me acknowledge that we continue to make those mistakes now, even though
Oh, yeah.
we're,
Yeah.
yeah, couples therapists who've been working for more than a decade on this sort of stuff. We still make the same mistakes in our own relationships.
Yeah. Yeah, the thing I always say is a bit like the instructions for walking a tightrope, one foot in front of the other, maintain balance, but you try doing it. I also, it helps me to think about elite sports, for example. So it is surprisingly difficult not to hit the first serve long, wide, or into the net, and those players have been doing that all of their adult lives, large proportion of their childhood lives as well. They've done that many, many times over, but there will be a huge number of mistakes. And I think of it like that in when I'm talking to couples, but when I'm thinking about my own life, why am I still making this mistake? Well, you will miss a penalty, you will, those things, I think, just an inevitable part of it. And I think that puts people off as well. Well, you've told me it. It's
Yep.
conceptually simple to understand. I've
Yep.
got it. I've remembered it. I've tried to deploy it and it's gone wrong. So you've given me the wrong analysis, or I'm crap at this, or this
Yep.
is the wrong person.
Yep.
And because often the other person won't respond in the way that you would like them to, perfectly, predictably, and whatever else, we've then got two variables, and then
Definitely. Rather than you're going to be together for thousands of days, you've tried it for one day, it didn't work. Maybe on day 150, you'll be better than you were on day one. You tried it yesterday. Yesterday was Monday. It didn't work. Well, today's Tuesday. Go again. Have another go.
Yeah, absolutely. I like that when you see Esther Perel doing her work, even on something like a podcast, where she's really coaching the couples through that conversation and stopping them in a way that can feel quite directive. I think for lots of for lots of practicing therapists, she's much more intervening than lots of therapists I know. But I like that style. It's like, no, we've got to get this right, and that would be the equivalent of just adjusting someone's position on a tennis court if you were coaching them, making sure their weight was transferred into their lead foot, being very specific about where they're taking the ball at that still point as it rises before it drops. There's always a moment where it's sort of paused in the air, and typically that would be, when you might be taking it, and being quite precise about those things. So I do think of that as a skill, as well as I think you were drawing attention to the sort of attitudinal bit. It's quite hard to swallow your ego to resist, fighting back or defending your position.
Or actually from a place of pain. Maybe that's the bit that I kind of missed off, that often there's a sense of, well, I'm feeling that way too, and I feel mad at you for that, and I don't quite know how to articulate that in a way that isn't just getting mad or getting defensive.
Yeah, a long time ago, I used to work in the prison service, and the kind of recurring complaint used to be that you would never, governors wear suits, and prison officers wear uniforms, and the recurring complaint would be, you never see anyone in a suit down here. You never see a governor come down. In those large operational services, it's a typical sort of complaint from the people who do the work, that the managers are absent, they're sort of bean counter somewhere, or they're doing something on a spreadsheet. And quite a nice piece of research the team of researchers from Cambridge University did was around appreciative inquiry. So they would hear that you never see a manager down here, as you would like to have a manager come and support you in what you're doing, or show appreciation for what you're doing, or recognize that something difficult goes on in this bit of the business, and that kind of reframe, I think, is useful in a relationship. So like, we never
Mm.
spend any time together anymore is a complaint, i.e. you're always at work, and I can hear it that way. Or I can be like, hang on, this is somebody asking for something, this is somebody wanting something. So you're trying to appreciate that and acknowledge what's actually being said, rather than spark on those words or hear it immediately as a dig. So what the researchers were trying to do was, rather than have the governor grades complain about the staff and the staff complain about the governor grades, they're kind of meeting in the middle of what's being wanted here, what is the desire that's being expressed. And I think there's something useful there in pausing and wondering what's being said. Even if you get it wrong in the moment in your relationship, you can still think about it. You can come back to it 2 minutes later, 20 minutes later, 2 hours later, 2 days later, and say, look, I think I got that wrong, and I think what you might have been trying to say was this. Is that closer to it?
Yeah, good. Good. I like that example. It's a nice example from the world of prisons. Quite a lot of richness in their life, because even that idea, I don't imagine that the solution to that is managers on the shop floor every day. I imagine that would get old real quick. I imagine what they're looking for in that example is something relatively small. It's kind of, do you care about how we feel? Do you even know what we do when you're not here? And you hear that in couples work as well, that kind of unseen labor of a relationship and keeping a house and a life ticking over that need
Yeah.
noticed and validated from time.
It starts a conversation, doesn't it? I think you're exactly right. So I think for a lot of I'm going to say guys, they're hearing that I don't know, their partner wants to debrief on the day, or wants to have an hour.
Yeah, that's where my kind of the alarm bells go off for that 3-hour evening idea for me.
Yeah,
God,
yeah.
bloody hell, an hour of looking into each other's eyes and talking about how we feel. Oh,
And
bloody hell.
yeah, and then you're dreading it, or
Yeah.
whatever else. But when I do that work with people, like, what do you actually want? What are you asking for? Then what would the specifics be? Like, make a proposal. Let's start thinking in practical terms. I don't think there's any difference, in particular between the sexes, or between what one person wants and what the other wants. Not massive differences. Like, that's not what's being asked for often. There's a recognition that life is busy. That person knows that their partner works hard. They like that about them. They chose somebody ambitious who had the ability to generate resources for the family. They're not saying, I wish you didn't
Mm.
work hard, or I wish you had a job which allowed you to be home all the time. But they are saying, can we find some points of connection? So in that example from the prison service, you're right. They're not saying, can the managers decamp down here or have their office around the corner? And the specific example was, I worked somewhere where the governor grade used to come down in the morning at the busiest processing time and it was completely unwelcome. And another guy would come down and he would stand in front of this massive whiteboard, which had all the ins and outs, like where the prison was sending its prisoners, which Crown Court they were going to, which Magistrates Court they were going to, etc., etc. It's all up there on a whiteboard. And he would say something like busy day. And it's like, you can see the numbers. And if you came down often, you would know that it's significantly busier today because of X and Y. So there's something like very specific that you can get into once the thing's been heard. Okay, sounds like you want something like this. Is that right? The other person can then counter and say, no, not at all. It's not that, it's this. Or yes, it is that, but it's also, and we can get there. But that initial bit of hearing, I suppose, feeling appreciated, acknowledged, your concerns being validated, that feels the bit that feels like oxygen, I guess, the bit that kickstarts it.
Mm. Mm. Good. Have we got to the bottom of it as far as you're concerned? Anything to add?
Yeah, maybe. I think the sign off might be something like, if you're choosing, if you're taking something practical away from this
Yeah,
conversation,
good.
choosing, it's sort of marrying up what we want, because I think some people do want less of that. They have a cooler style. They are, they're less interested in those big romantic gestures. Some people are really interested in that. Like, that is the very point of the relationship. Poems and flowers and post-it notes in lunchboxes and all of that is the lifeblood of it. And I think if you want that, I've got no beef with that at all, if that's your thing. But you're going to need to find somebody who believes in that as well and can do that for you. And if you take a more practical stance and you think of love as more like service and more like kind of practical things, that's worth knowing as well, and then we might want to moderate what is a reasonable ask in those situations.
I agree with most of that. I'm a bit more skeptical about the need to pair up with someone that has a similar approach to big dramatic gestures and the like. I think if the core stuff around values and expectations from life and personality fit, I think you can broadly live with not having a post-it in your lunchbox, as long as you're as long as your partner knows that you appreciate being thought of and you appreciate certain ways of expressing love. I think you can, in the main, if everything else is working, that would be one of those areas where I'm just like, you can
Maybe let that go.
you can probably live with that.
I'm also saying the opposite sometimes to people, though, right? That the person who is maybe cooler or more withdrawn in the relationship can also be themselves with more skill. So one person could dial it
Mm,
down if it's hard for the other person, or they've just got a
totally.
somewhat inflated expectation. But it's not that difficult to remember to buy some flowers if that's an important thing. It's not that
Absolutely agree.
difficult to occasionally
We
arrange
often
a
hear
date night and reach out to the sitter and be the person who sees a film, thinks my partner would like that, books it, and arranges that. Even if that
yeah,
is hard for you and you're not naturally organized,
totally.
it can be.
Yeah, yeah, you appreciate you having someone do some work for you. You often hear the refrain in couples work, don't you? Well, it's just not me, and that's
Yeah,
just often it's just not good enough to say that. It's still
yeah,
okay. It's not you, but that doesn't mean you can't have a good go at it once in a while.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
I agree with that. Well,
Yeah.
I appreciate you, Matt. I appreciate all you bring to this podcast. Wouldn't be the same without you.
I appreciate you saying that.
But you can't do everything on your own.
Nice one. It's
It's
good to
good to
see you.
see you. Take care.
Bye.